Let's delve into for a moment the history of opioid use, because I believe it helps us understand where we've come from when it comes to goes as far as to opioid prescriptions and the drug itself. I call it the trust factor. When you go to your doctor, you want to trust your doctor, that your doctor has your best interest at heart. He knows what he's doing. He's well educated. And that's the case most always. But what has happened in the last few years, as we'll see coming up, when the opioid wave hit and so many people were diagnosed with back pain and other types of physical trauma pain, and they were given Vicodin and other forms, Percocet, Oxycontin, Oxycodone. When they began to be prescribed these medications, originally doctors were told, look, this has no side effects whatsoever. It's not addicting. And so they were educated this way. A friend of mine, Dr. Ben Fickenshire here in Virginia Beach, he's actually in Chesapeake, is head of the emergency room there. And, he told me, he said, Dr. Paul, we created this mess as doctors, and it's up to us to fix it. He said, we used to give out prescriptions for opioids like they were candy because we were told they had no side effects. And now, unfortunately, with the history and education that we have, we realize that it's not the case. And you want to trust your doctor, certainly. So it was not done intentionally. It's not that they meant to harm people ever, by any means. Back in the 1800s, during the Civil War, they gave people alcohol and they would get them drunk for surgery, or they would, just give them amounts of alcohol for their pain. And then the opioids were discovered for physical injuries. And when they began giving out opioids, heroin, in quite large amounts, then people became addicted back then as well. They calculate in the 1800s that at least 1 in 200 early Americans were addicted to morphine for one reason or another, and it became an opioid addiction. And so morphine treatment became the cure-all. There were concerns, but it wasn't enough to really know what was going on. And then you had people, traveling in their wagons, as you've seen in the country and the cowboy movies, selling their goods, and they had snake oil. Now in Virginia, we say oil. Up north, you say oil. My wife says oil. I say oil. And so you had people that were going from town to town selling morphine. And they meant well, and they thought it was something that was a cure-all. I can remember where I'm from in North Carolina originally. My grandparents, my grandmother would give paregoric to babies to numb their mouth when they were teething. Well, that had a morphine effect as well. And so, these people were selling morphine from town to town, and not really knowing, what problems it might cause or what it would be. And so we have these different waves of overdose deaths that have happened. In the 1900s, we saw the rise of opioid prescription deaths happened, and we see how that just continued to rise from wave after wave. Nobody would have known how many people that were dealing with different forms of chronic pain, what would happen. People were suffering through their pain. A lot of them, what they were doing is, even though they had a realistic, true form of physical pain, they would just power through it and work through it. What began to happen as opioids were prescribed is the slightest pain, they began to get medications. Millions of people during the 90s had both physical and emotional pain, but it was not a problem so much to them at that time because they suffered through it. They struggled through it. They fought through the pain. It was a mindset, that if you have pain, you just work through it. And so with that mindset, there was not as much of an addictive factor. People avoided taking medications as much as possible, and they went on through their hard labor, their work, whatever they were doing with the pain that they might have had at the time. And so then we see that the 1800 opioid epidemic faded away into history for at least those 90 years. So the first wave of the 1900s, the second wave in 2010, rapid increases in overdose deaths began involving heroin. We saw it imported from other countries. We saw other places bringing a great influence in its use. And so then by 2013, there were significant increases in overdose deaths. And we see how you see here any opioid was rising. And then we saw the commonly prescribed opioids, heroin, we saw that climbing. And then other synthetic opioids began to take over, such as tramadol and especially fentanyl, which is today still a serious problem. And this is according to the CDC. By 2002, many opioid-based pain-relieving drugs were available for use. It didn't take much to get them, and people were getting those. They were being overprescribed, and we have seen, in different places, and there are movies out and television documentaries, series of programs where they, talk about how they would have these pharmaceutical mills, where they rent a little store shop in a strip mall, and people were coming and going, buying massive amounts of opioids. The new opioid epidemic, by 2006, people realized something seriously wrong. They become strung out on their medications. They were now having serious side effects, and they were having serious family and life relational problems from something that they thought was non-habit forming. And so these physicians were even illegally prescribing these substances. And so it became so easy to get a hold of for most any condition. And so heroin addiction then became a very serious problem for the community. To begin to counteract this became very difficult. It continued. And so people continued to use these medications. As you see, it kept growing and growing with other drugs coming into factors. So this